What were the key lessons learned for the Army from the Spanish-American War? Who was Elihu Root, and how did he transform the Army in the early 20th century? What changes took place that improved the National Guard? For answers to these questions and more Army transformational insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, I'm speaking with CMH historian Dr. Matt Margis about the transformational time period for the Army after the Spanish-American War and going into the First World War. Welcome, Matt, and thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
So Dr. Matt Margis works with the U.S. Army Center of Military History as the historian for the Office of the Chief of Staff of the Army. He has been with CMH since 2017, and prior to his current position, he worked as a researcher for the CMH Histories Division. His area of expertise is late 19th century and early 20th century military professionalization, which is exactly the focus of this episode, so we got the right guy here. He graduated with a PhD from Iowa State University in 2016. His dissertation, America's Progressive Army, How the National Guard Grew Out of Progressive Era Reforms, won the Karras Award for Outstanding Dissertation in 2017, and I think that's great. He's currently converting his dissertation into a manuscript for publication. Dr. Margis has written articles on African American service during World War I and numerous book reviews. He recently published a chapter on consolidating gains during Operation Market Garden in an Army University Press volume on large-scale combat operations. So great, Matt. Anything else that about your background that we need to cover?
No, I think that about covers it.
All right, well, great. Well, you know, you were with us for the last episode talking about the Spanish-American War. And so now, as we begin this, learning the lessons learned from the Spanish-American War, can you just give us an overview of, what the Army looked like coming out of the war, and what were those key lessons learned?
Yeah, so after the main fighting in Cuba ends in August 1898, and going into 1890 as the treaty that ends the war in December, by 1899, the U.S. government, the U.S. Army realizes there's a lot of problems, particularly with logistics, supply, transportation. The size of the Army was too small. The ability to expand the Army in a systematic way failed during the mobilization. The attempts were there to try to use volunteerism to fill the ranks, but that wasn't really efficient. Effectiveness just kind of waned. There was no easy way to incorporate the militia into the basically the Army structure. Right. And there was the bigger problem was the functions of the various bureaus there was this constant infighting between Quartermaster Department, the Adjutant General Corps, etc. All the kind of the bureaus that kind of drove the Army. They were somewhat independent of themselves, and there was no unifying structure to oversee that.
So were they called bureaus at the time?
Yeah,
as opposed to branches is what we call them now.
Right. They were the different bureaus, and really one of the other issues was the commanding general of the U.S. Army, the position that had existed since General Washington. Mm-hmm. Was somewhat ill-defined. And over the course of the 19th century, there was a lot of back and forth on whether this was like a chief of staff or if this was more of a field commander. And by 1898, in the years after the Civil War, it became much more of a field commander type position. And it really was ineffective at, again, unifying the Army for overseas operations. So they basically, the war just demonstrated that something needed to happen.
Right. And because at this point, now with the success of the Spanish-American War, the defeat, we defeated the Philippine insurrection, the Army has now expanded. America has expanded, and of course the Army is part of that. We're overseas, so so now we're a bigger Army. We have more responsibility. So reforms were needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, and as you just mentioned, victory in the war actually provided the catalyst for those reforms, because now we have this overseas force. How do we sustain it? How do we manage it? How do we continue to rotate soldiers through everything? Everything kind of comes into play.
So we get a new Army. Is it Chief of Staff, or what's the title at the time?
Well, eventually the Chief of Staff will be created in 1903, but before that, it really has to start with then, just as now, civilian control of the military, right? So it requires congressional action. It requires some kind of executive push, and it's really going to start with Elihu Root, who's going to become Secretary of War in August of 1899. He's going to replace Russell Alger. Alger oversaw the mobilization and was pretty much dragged through the mud for how it didn't go well. So William McKinley is going to replace him with Root, and when Theodore Roosevelt becomes president, he's going to maintain Root as the Secretary of War.
So what's some background on Root? Where did he come from? What was his experience?
So he was a lawyer. He had served. He was kind of a well-known. He was a federal attorney for a while in the 1870s, I think. He actually defended Boss Tweed in a New York case. But he was not a military person. He was not. He had no military experience. He didn't work with the Army. He didn't work with the Navy in any capacity. At the same time, Theodore Roosevelt, who was serving in the military when he becomes president, right? He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy prior to serving prior to resigning to go fight in Cuba. Root does not have that background. Root was a lawyer. He was educated. But he understood bureaucracy and he understood efficiency. He was a progressive. This is the progressive era. The kind of the focus of a lot of progressivism that I think gets misunderstood today when we hear the term progressive. But it was really about middle class progressives in the 1880s, 90s, and then in the early 20th century. They really wanted to reform society to make it effective and efficient. They saw this idea of scientific management, that if you could implement kind of managerial protocols across society, you could reshape it in the way that they saw as better. Whether it was better or not is up for debate, but it was how they viewed it. And so Root comes from that background. So he believes that if you could just apply kind of a managerial scientific approach to the War Department, that it would improve efficiency, improve effectiveness, and improve overall quality of the soldiers and officers.
Yeah. So what was his innovations? What changes did he implement?
Yeah. So he's going to push for a handful of changes. And again, he can't do this on his own. He needs Congress to ultimately do it, and it's not going to happen overnight. But what he wants to do is create a general staff with a chief who would be subordinate to the Secretary of War, the Secretary of Army today, of the Army today, but at the time the Secretary of War, who would basically be the chief, who would then oversee a centralized staff that would actually implement executive policy. That this would supplant the bureau system, that the bureau chiefs would no longer have autonomy. They would now fall under this general staff that would answer directly to the Secretary of War, i.e. the President. So the idea was that by doing that, you would have a more efficient staff process, and it would reduce the fight, because a lot of what these bureaus were doing was they would rub elbows with senators and congressmen. It would be, hey, Senator, give the Quartermaster Corps some more money, and they would write bills that would give the Quartermaster. So that it was very much these kind of independent generals who were out kind of self-interested. They wanted to reduce that, and his idea was that general staff would do that. He believed that the planning was lax, which it certainly was. So one of his reforms is going to be to establish and then grow the U.S. Army War College. He believed that the curriculum and the processes at West Point were a bit outdated, and that he didn't think West Point should be an engineering school. He wanted it to be much more of a military school. And he also thought it needed to be larger and it needed a larger faculty. So he's going to work to expand that. He establishes now these. I shouldn't say establish. The schools were already out there. There were branch schools, the cavalry school, the infantry school, artillery school. Those already existed, but he is going to make efforts to expand those and make them much more manageable, make them much more effective, and actually get them to professionalize them effectively. Yes, and then finally, he is going to push for a way. Now, he's not a big fan of the National Guard. He didn't think the National Guard or the militia at the time was an effective force, but he's going to be up against some very strong lobbying efforts. So he basically will say, okay, if you can improve the efficiency of the Guard, then let's stick with it for a while. And so one of the things they're going to do is figure out ways to actually improve, as they sought, the effectiveness of what would become the National Guard in 1903.
Right. But with him creating the general staff, was this just something that he created, or is he basing that on a model from other countries?
There were certainly models. One of the key models, or one of the main ones that they would look to, was the Prussian, or by this time the German model. Germany had a general staff. It didn't look exactly like what the U.S. one would look like. There had been a semblance of a general staff in the United States during the Civil War. France had a staff, Switzerland. So there were some European kind of staff processes, and other reformers, particularly like Colonel Emory Upton, he had gone through Europe and he had observed and written a book, The Armies of Europe and Asia. Most of his ideas aren't going to be incorporated until after he's dead. He commits suicide, but by 1900, his books that have been posthumously released, right, those are starting to influence. And so there's kind of foreign ideas, but also Root is just looking at the business world. He's looking at how do corporations function, and they don't function by having every little piece of a corporation being independent. They need a CEO effectively, and that's what he sets out to do. But again, it's going to require congressional action, so it takes some time. In 1901, Congress authorizes or passes the Army Reorganization Act. This grows the size of the regular army, to about 65,000. It creates like this. It changes some billeting limits, like that you could serve if you came to serve temporarily, for example, in the Quartermaster Corps. It basically capped that at 4 years. So you couldn't be a line officer, serve for the Quartermaster Corps, get a brevet promotion to colonel, and be there 10 years. They kind of capped that. So that was like baby steps. It wouldn't be until 1903 that the General Staff Act is actually passed.
And who was the first chief of staff?
So the first chief of staff will be Lieutenant General Samuel Baldwin Marks Young. And at the time, it was a little bit different than it is now. A lot of the functions, a lot of the processes weren't well defined yet. How exactly the chief of staff would look, what his role was not clearly defined. It was not a capstone position like it is today. Today, the chief of staff, you serve, there's nowhere else to go unless you become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So basically, once you do your 4-year term as chief of staff, today, that's it. You retire from the Army. That wasn't the case then. Now, for some of the early chiefs, it was almost a pat on the back. Congratulations, you're 64 and a half years old. Your mandatory retirement is in 6 months. You're the new chief of staff of the Army. And 6 months later, they're out. So it didn't have the kind of the prestige for those early kind of chiefs that it's going to develop over time. And part of that was because Congress, even in creating the General Staff in 1903, was still wary of the bureaus. And they still didn't want to completely supplant the bureau system. Because again, they're very cozy with some of these bureau chiefs. And so they'll kind of establish a general staff of 44 total officers, with the chief being, again, a general officer. Some of them were given a 3rd star early on, like General Young. Others weren't. Others stayed at the 2-star level while they were chief. But it's really doesn't become the functioning thing that it will until a few years down the road. Some of its early successes of the staff, they create new field service regulations in 1905, 1910, 1914. They're the ones that are going to make a plan for an expeditionary force that's going to go to Cuba in 1906 briefly and come back. They're going to coordinate the relief of the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 efforts. They're going to draw up some war plans. The Army War College actually becomes sort of again, this is a root reform, a root creation. Once it's established also in 1903, it's going to become sort of a unofficial staff office. It's going to do a lot of the planning, coordinating, because, again, that bureau system is still there. So they just kind of go around and use the War College as sort of this unofficial capacity to do that.
Yeah.
It's really not going to be until Leonard Wood becomes chief of staff when
was that?
So he'll become chief of staff in what was the year?
Well, this is prior to World War I, though.
Prior to World War I, he will become chief of staff in 1910.
Okay.
And what's going to kind of happen there is, again, there's not really a clear role. And the most influential bureau chief at the time was the adjutant general, Major General Fred C. Ainsworth. And Ainsworth had a lot of power. Prior to 1910, the adjutant general was really more the leader of the staff in a lot of ways. So it was they had a lot of power, and they kind of absorbed. They handled all the administrative functions of the Army, and Wood is going to basically, starting in 1910, kind of go to fight with Ainsworth. Root is gone by this time, and a couple of the secretaries of war and a couple of the early chiefs of staff really didn't take much of an active role. They kind of business as usual. Wood is going to find, General Leonard Wood is going to find his kind of kindred spirit in Secretary of War Henry Stimson.
Okay.
Stimson comes in around the same time as him, and the two of them are going to see eye to eye on what needs to happen. And basically, Wood is, like I said, he's going to go to war with Ainsworth. And there's a lot of bitter fighting. And Wood is going to do some things that you kind of have to laugh at. Like he's gonna issue some orders out of the general staff that basically say anything the adjutant general corps does, anything the adjutant general does, we have to stamp off on it. So it was basically just a way of like creating chaos for making Ainsworth's life more difficult. Really to try to goad him. Because they realize that Ainsworth has a lot of power. They realize that Ainsworth and the Adjutant General Corps has a lot of power with Congress. One of his most influential friends is Congressman James Hay of Virginia, who just happens to be, head of the Armed Services Committee.
Oh, wow.
So there's a lot of these kind of issues going on, and basically Stimson and Wood goad Ainsworth into vocal insubordination. And then we'll say,
they're really trying to push him out.
They're trying to push him out. And their choices are, you have just now been insubordinate. You can either retire or face court-martial. And that's how Ainsworth's career ends.
So he retired. He didn't call their bluff.
He retires. Now, he doesn't go away. He just starts working behind the scenes, again, with his very influential friends. Some of that's going to come into play in 1916. So, for example, when I'll talk about this a little later, but the National Defense Act of 1916 actually cuts some of the staff power, but the Secretary of War at the time decides to interpret it differently. But it's a back and forth. It's a bitter fight. But what Wood is able to do is, by the time his tenure ends in 1914, he was able to create a structure where the chief of staff has more power. And then his successors, especially up through World War I, Hugh Lennox Scott, Tasker Bliss, they're going to be chiefs who are going to expand on that. And then once the war gets going, once the United States actually goes to World War I, goes out to fight in World War I, the staff becomes much more important because now it is that coordinating effort.
Right.
And so the kind of it really does succeed in breaking the bureau power, and then subsequent National Defense Acts do away with the divergent system.
Oh, wow. All right. And you mentioned also, and I don't want to jump away from any of the Root reforms that you think are important to note, but the National Guard went through transition also. So unless there's something else on the Root reforms, do you want to talk about the National Guard changes?
Absolutely. So the National Guard, if you think back to post-Civil War era, there was no National Guard. It was the militia. And the militia's reputation was not stellar. Things have to change after 1877. What happens in 1877 is the Great Railroad Strike. And the federal government is going to send some troops in some cases. In other cases, governors are going to call their militias to quell the strike and to basically try to restore order in places where riots were breaking out. And it does not go well for the militia. In some cases, soldiers who come from a very middle to upper class background are very hostile towards the strikers and will fire without orders into crowds.
Oh, wow.
In other cases, militia soldiers who come from more working class backgrounds will find solidarity with the strikers and drop their weapons and go join the strike side.
Wow.
And so it's not a good look. And officers in the militia realize that. Officers in the militia realize that our organization as a whole, this kind of national group of independent armies, really, about 48 independent little mini armies under the control of the governor, that if they want to stay around, if they want to be relevant, they need to change. So in 1879, they're going to create the National Guard Association, which is made up of militia officers. A lot of them start calling themselves the National Guard, trying to break the negative connotation. And they're going to launch a series of reforms from within where they're trying to improve efficiency and effectiveness. They realize what they need to do this, though, is congressional support, because if a state governor only gives, or a state legislature only gives X amount of money to the militia, there's only so much that these officers can do to reform from within. They do convince Congress to allow militia officers to start going to some of these schools. They do start basically improving their own training capacities. In the 1890s, regular Army officers will go to militia encampments and kind of oversee training efforts. So there are these efforts for about 30 years, 25 years, where they're trying to improve. But Congress is just, the final hump is the big money, because Congress doesn't want to allocate money to these states for this purpose. That's going to change after 1898. After the mobilization issue, where there was no easy way to get the militia into the Army, they realized, okay, the effectiveness is just not there. And the 1792 law that they had been operating on, the Militia Act of 1792, just did not apply in 1902.
Right.
So partly under Root's efforts, partly guided by the National Guard Association, but especially guided by a Ohio National Guard, Ohio militia general named Charles Dick, who also happened to be a congressman. He replaced the old, as they called him, he'll eventually replace the Ohio Kingmaker, Mark Hanna. When he dies, he'll become Senator Dick. But in 1903, he's Congressman Dick, 1902. And he's going to work with Root. He's going to work with the National Guard Association. He's going to work with other members of Congress, and they are going to create a bill that'll become known as the Militia Act of 1903, commonly known as the Dick Act, that will define the National Guard as the organized militia of the United States. So it takes that constitutional line and says, this is now the National Guard. The organized militia of the United States is the National Guard. The old idea where every able-bodied male between 18 and 45 serves in the quote-unquote militia, they're still going to be on the books. That's the unorganized militia. So that's actually going to be the kind of the premise for the draft law that's going to come out in 1917, is that every able-bodied male between 18 and 45 is quote-unquote in the militia. But they created this idea of the organized and unorganized. And they allowed and there's going to be some changes. It's not, again, it doesn't happen overnight, but that first move in 1903 allows the president, in cases of emergency, invasion or insurrection, to federalize the organized militia for up to 9 months. Now that's not a fix-all because it doesn't allow for overseas deployment. It's capped at 9 months, but it's a first step. States are given until 1907 to comply because they also have to meet training standards. Part of what comes out of this is that there will be federal inspectors that will go to these Guard regiments, which is now the National Guard, and they will basically see what their level of readiness is. What are you training on? What are you doing? Are you all wearing uniforms?
Right.
What are your weapons? These types of things. And if you're not, if you don't comply, you lose your status. And a lot of governors were sort of at first like, well, what do we care? Okay, they're no longer National Guard. They're still our militia. What do we care? Well, the money was now quadrupled. And so these states are now getting a lot of extra funding as long as they maintain these up to standard. So the money is a part of it. But even with that, a lot of states are slow to develop this. And by 1907, when they're all supposed to be in place, I think 4 or 5 states are actually in compliance. And the rest are just not there yet. And so in 1908, they're going to make some amendments to the Dick Act. They're going to make some amendments to it again in 1910. They're going to make some changes to how it's implemented. And by 1910, it still looked very similar to 1903, but now most states were in compliance and still couldn't be deployed overseas without governor approval. But the president could activate the militia or the National Guard for insurrection or invasion for up to a year.
Okay.
In which case they would also
invasion against the United States.
Yes,
You mean, not
right.
the U.S. going out and
Right.
invading. And when would that change for overseas deployments?
That's going to change in 1916 with the National Defense Act.
All right.
And I guess the one other thing that what this does with the National Guard is it also allows, if they're federalized, and this is one of the big things for the states, they would now be paid by the Army if they're federalized.
okay.
So it would. It also did away with the practice of electing officers. A lot of militia units prior to 1900 still. Not all. That was kind of going away. That was dying out. Again, those internal reforms, this process was dying out. But some states still use this where officers were chosen by the soldiers.
No kidding.
And
oh, wow.
it was, they did away with that. They said that you can't do that anymore. They need to be, officers need to be trained. They need to go through these schools. They need to know they need to take tests to prove that they actually have they actually know what they're doing.
At what point, excuse me, were National Guard officers going to the War College?
So they start being allowed to go after basically right away. Not a lot. Only a handful are allowed. There's only so many slots, and I think 1 or 2 are given to National Guard officers.
And who would pay for that?
That would be paid for. Getting there was kind of on their own. But they were
no TDY, huh?
Yeah, no TDY. But once they were there, their pay would come. They were considered on federal status.
Federal service, okay.
And a thing to kind of remember is at the time, this is all tied to popular perception. These reforms, especially for the National Guard, don't necessarily come just from, I've kind of been making it sound like this is, they realize there's a need for overseas service and all this, they need to have this effectiveness. But it's really coming from a lot of popular perceptions. The militia was not used often in this role. If you actually look at, it's only a handful of times, but those handful of times are very, very public and very prominent. Right. And that's during race riots, labor strikes, and other and similar issues or similar instances. Those are very kind of, people see it. It's very visible. And when the militia performs well, it doesn't get talked about a lot. When the militia doesn't perform well, it's national news. And that's one of the reasons the militia really wants to improve effectiveness. It wants to go out during labor strikes, during race riots, and say, we're professional soldiers. We're not just a bunch of ragtag people. And that's what's really pushing this. And by 1910, it's almost there.
Now, you had the Army Reserve also created sometime during this time period.
The reserve is going to be a bit different. The reserve is going to, in 1916, one of the other things the National Defense Act of 1916 will do is create the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC. The National or the Army Reserve, as we kind of conceive of it today, is going to be a post World War I creation. In World War I, they create the National Army, drafted troops, divisions 76 and up, and that's going to be kind of what will later on become the Army Reserve.
Okay.
But in this period, 1900 to about 1917, the Reserve is the National Guard.
But now you've mentioned the National Defense Act of 1916 a few times, but also that in 1916 we were being threatened
Yes.
from Mexico by Pancho Villa, and we launched the punitive expedition into Mexico. So a couple questions here. Was the National Defense Act a response to that, or did it come before the punitive expedition?
So the wheels were in motion, but a lot of the failures of the punitive expedition and what's going to happen with the National Guard deployment after, although that National Guard deployment didn't really have much to do with the pushing of the bill. So the wheels have been in motion for some time, but a lot of that is going to be sped up in 1916. And another important part of this is, of course, by 1916, the war had been raging in Europe for 2 years, and the preparedness movement in the United States, 1915, is in full swing. And so Congress is reacting to all that.
There was an inevitability, a sense of inevitability that we may get into that war.
Yeah, or at least we had to be prepared for something.
Okay.
And so the National Defense Act is kind of a response to a lot of those things. But in 1916, it kind of just all comes together.
And then, so the punitive expedition, how did the Root reforms affect how we responded to that?
So yeah, I won't get into
It's the first real test of it.
It is in some ways, and I won't get into too many details of like operations there or anything. But so tensions with Mexico had been high. Francisco Pancho Villa raids a couple of U.S. towns. They send this punitive expedition under now Brigadier General John J. Pershing, who jumped over, I forget how many hundreds of people to get his from captain. He gets to go from captain to brigadier general. Not a pretty successful promotion there. And some of the reforms are there in the sense that the Army is now, the general staff is now overseeing how this is going to carry out. The general staff is making some of the policy decisions. The officers who go, the soldiers who go, are better trained, better. They've gone through these new schools. The problems that they're going to face is, one, northern Mexico is big.
Yeah.
And you're chasing effectively one person and his very small army in hostile enemy territory. Another problem is technology is untested. The U.S. Army hasn't had a lot of experience with planes, with radios, with automobiles. European armies had by this time. Americans hadn't. This is a good test for some of those, and a lot of ways to see that, hey, our plane doesn't really perform that well. So there's a lot of those kind of tests going on, but it didn't really. The reforms that Root put in place that started in 1903, or that started 1900 and went through 1903-4, they're not really going to be showcased until the National Guard goes to the border, and then again in the First World War. The National Guard border deployment was a specific response to the punitive expedition not capturing Villa. President Wilson said, what if he does it again?
Yeah.
And so in June of 1916, about a week after the National Defense Act passes, but before it goes into effect, he mobilizes the entire National Guard and sends it to the Mexican border.
The entire National Guard?
The entire National Guard is existing, so all 48 states and territories.
Wow.
I believe Utah didn't. One of the states didn't have a National Guard, so that one didn't go. But it was 48. So about 140,000 soldiers are going to go to the Mexican border.
Wow.
And they're going to find a lot of problems. They're going to find that they're not really prepared either. They're out of shape. They do some marches and they're out of shape. They can't do it. They don't know how to fire their weapons. There are new weapons in place. So the Army's adopted its early machine guns. The Army has issued the Springfield 1903 to a lot of soldiers.
Right. We have aviation now.
Aviation is coming into play, and they realize that a lot of these, for all the reforms the National Guard have been doing, for all the efforts that have been going into it, they still just weren't quite ready. So what's going to end up happening is from June 1916 till February of 1917, and some of these Guard units are only there for a month, some are there for 2, some are there for the whole time. But they go through these, it's basically a prolonged training exercise. And they're not training to capture Pancho Villa. They're doing mock battles with 10,000 attackers against 5,000 entrenched defenders.
Oh, wow.
They're training for the kind of fight they're going to be seeing later on the Western Front.
My understanding is the reason we had so many people on the border at the time, whether it was National Guard or regular Army, was just like you're saying, is that training, that envisioning the need to deploy, but also was that show of force to the Mexicans.
It was a bit, and I think it was at first. When there's some debate on whether or not Woodrow Wilson, how he really wanted to use this massive force at the border. The debate is basically, was he sincere in just saying there is a real threat of further bandit incursions, or was he, as he's running in 1916, this is campaign season, as he's running on, he kept us out of war, was he actually training to go to war?
Yeah.
There's some debates on that, but I think there was sincerity early on. But by August of 1916, it was pretty clear that there were going to be no more raids, that that threat had subsided, but they're still there.
So it really became a training ground.
It really does. And so there's sort of 2 unexpected consequences, one positive, one negative. One of the good things is that now you had a cohort of 140,000 National Guard soldiers who were highly trained. Better trained in a lot of cases than some of their regular Army counterparts, and certainly better trained than any volunteers who would be coming into the Army in 1917. The problem is that in the National Defense Act, which I've mentioned a few times, one of the things it does for the National Guard is it creates the ability to be deployed overseas. The president can now federalize the National Guard and deploy it overseas. But in order to make that kind of all legally fine, they had to basically say that now if you enlisted the National Guard, you have to take 2 oaths. Before, you just took an oath to your state. Now you have to take an oath to your state and a second oath to the federal government. Today, when you join the National Guard, they just combine that into one. But there was 2 separate ones. And a lot of soldiers at the border who deployed under the old 1910 law were told, okay, you got to take a second oath now. And they said, no, I didn't sign up to join the regular Army. I signed up to join the militia. I joined up to join the National Guard. I don't want the president to be able to send me anywhere. So I'm not going to take the second oath. So Secretary of War Newton Baker, after some back and forth, finally says, fine. Anybody who doesn't want to take the oath, you're discharged. Okay. So so the National Guard is going to go from about 140,000 down to about 120,000, and then it's going to shrink even more. A lot of soldiers just leave. So when border duty ends, the National Guard was actually smaller. But those National Guardsmen who remained, again, they were trained. A lot of them are going to become the cohort who's going to be some of the first soldiers to go over to France, and then the other ones who aren't in those divisions will be the trainers to train up people who are coming in.
Yeah, absolutely.
A couple other things for the National Defense Act, I'll just kind of end that. As I mentioned, it creates the ROTC program, and one of its authors was James Hay, the same James Hay who was friends with Fred Ainsworth. So it's going to shrink the size of the general staff, and it's actually written in there that in some ways it can strengthen the bureaus back. But Secretary of War Newton Baker, he interprets that as basically applying administrative details to each bureau as being subordinate to the staff. So he kind of just says, okay, I'm gonna play this game. If you're giving special duties to each bureau, fine. I'm just going to say they're all subordinate to the staff, and Chief of Staff Bliss, you're still in charge. So the attempt to kind of undermine the staff fails. It actually strengthens it.
Oh, wow. So by the end of this, February 17, we Zimmerman telegram, that time frame comes out, and April 6th of 1917, we declare war on Germany. So what does the Army look like at that period?
The Army still, unfortunately, is not quite ready. The regular Army was still small. Its authorized strength was, I think, about 115,000, but it was not there. There were still only about 70,000 regular Army soldiers. Right. As I mentioned, the National Guard, it has 80,000. In February of 1917, 80,000 Guardsmen are still federalized at the border. The rest of the 120,000 have returned home. A lot of them have left service. And even though they're kind of better trained than they had been before, kind of working through that still leaves you with about 200,000 total soldiers who actually have a certain modicum of training and expertise. Right. It's going to require millions of soldiers to fight in France. So
I think we mobilized about 4 million.
It'll get up to 4 million. Yeah, 2 million will actually be overseas with another 2 million waiting to go. Yeah. So it's not ready yet. It's not there yet. It's going to get there, but it's going to require a conscription act and everything else.
Right, but we were in a much better position because of the Root reforms, because of the National Defense Act. Those lessons learned coming out of the Spanish-American War made a difference.
Absolutely. That sets the foundation for the ability to conscript an army. That sets the foundation for the president to be able to just draft the militia, the National Guard, and this is the phrasing they use, to draft the National Guard into federal service.
Oh, wow.
To basically build up the divisional strength. It allows the United States to get a force, small though it is, to France early. It's going to take time for the American Expeditionary Force to get ready to go. The U.S. expects to fight in 1919. So their anticipation is, okay, we have a year to build an army before we're going to be. No one expected it to end in 1918. Yeah. And so they had this training system put in place that they never really get to fulfill, but it sets the foundation. All those Root reforms set the foundation. Having the War College there as a planning entity, having the staff there that establishes an intelligence section, establishes an operations planning section that can actually go through and streamline all the processes. George Gaethels, who I talked about last time, who oversaw the completion of the Panama Canal, he's going to be brought back in, and he's going to serve in a staff position to help plan the deployments of soldiers from the United States to Europe throughout the war. So there's a lot of these things that come into place. They all kind of coalesce, and the Root reforms that start at the turn of the century really set the foundation for the Army to be able to do all that.
Yeah. It took about 16, 17 years.
It took some time.
But it has a lasting legacy. I mean, to this day, the Root reforms are some things may have changed, but they're still in place.
Absolutely. The general staff, again, it's changed quite a bit, and its makeup and it's some of the nuance, but it's still there. The National Guard is still the organized militia of the United States. It is still it's a key component now of the total Army, along with the Army Reserve.
Yeah, and we've seen that with all the recent wars.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can say from Desert Shield, Desert Storm to now, the National Guard and the Army Reserve combined have made up at least 40% of our forces overseas. So,
absolutely.
Was there anything else about the Root reforms or the transformation that you want to address?
No, I think that about covers it.
All right, well, great. And before we close, it's time for our Who trivia about this time period. So do you have any significant trivia you want to share?
Yeah, just kind of something I find comedic. One of the unintended consequences, I mentioned that oath issue, right? A lot of these National Guard soldiers saying, I'm not taking a second oath, and so they get out. And so they think, all right, I'm free and clear. I'm out of the Army. I'm out of this. Well, they're still eligible for the draft. So a lot of them are going to actually be drafted in 1917 and 1918 against their will, where maybe had they just stayed in, they would have been at least with their local unit.
Oh wow!
And so that's going to kind of be an issue. And then the other one, sort of less comical, is after war. The Judge Advocate General is going to declare that if you served in the regular army, your state obligation is no longer. So it's actually he's going to flip that, and the National Guard is going to all but disappear in 1919.
Oh, wow.
And it's got to rebuild itself. But
fascinating.
so a lot of little interesting things that come out of this.
And we'll address a lot more of that in future episodes, including, I know we just briefly touched on the Mexican expedition and the beginning of World War I, but we'll have separate episodes in the very near future, more in-depth discussions about all of those key events. So, Matt, thanks so much again for your discussion and insights today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Covering the Root reforms and then the Army in transition. I mean, a critical time period that really set up the Army for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st century. So,
absolutely.
Very important. And if anyone wants to learn more about the Army in transition and the Root reforms, or learn more about Army history in general, I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please join us every week on this podcast for more in-depth discussions as we cover topics from all eras of U.S. Army history, examining battles, soldier experiences, equipment, weapons, and tactics. Thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.